All right, let's read here about Richard Allen. Richard Allen. What's up, Richard Allen? Born into slavery in Delaware. What happened at one point is he was sold from one master to another. Sold off from his mom, though. So he got ripped away from his mom, and he never saw her again. And some of his siblings. Only some of his other siblings went with him to the new plantation. This is not cool. This is what slavery did. Now, the master that he did have, Sturgis, he said he was not a Christian, but he was affectionate and tenderhearted, what the world called a good master. So Allen is kind of fair in that appraisal. But listen to this. This is amazing. I can't read it all, but this is again from the Free Indeed book. He gives his conversion, which is quite moving. I can't read it all though again here. But afterwards, he became an evangelist, and his brother and his sister, whom he was still with, the ones he still had, were converted as well. And the neighbors scoffed because he began preaching at other plantations, and they scoffed, well, he's not going to be any use to you now, as a slave, because he had, quote, got religion. That's what he said, right? So Allen knew about this. He knew that there was doubters, scoffers, that said, hey, now that you've got a Christian slave, he's not going to be any use to you. Which, again, goes against the narrative that a lot of tropes that are, that's what they wanted, good, docile Christian slaves. It's actually the opposite when you read the first-hand accounts. So Allen did this. This is a quote. We held a council together that we would attend more faithfully to our master's business so that it should not be said that religion made us worse servants, end quote. Listen to that. Richard Allen got together with his brother and sister and said, hey, we become Christians now. We need to become better servants to this guy to disprove them. So the gospel is not that he wanted to, he hated slavery, but so that the gospel's not besmirched. These are amazing men. Okay. Oh, Richard Allen. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Excellent. That's awesome. I love when you guys do stuff like that. Thank you. He's born February 14th, you're saying, so he just had a birthday. All right. I'll put those quotes on the screen there. How about that? Because that's a good contribution. Appreciate that. So what happened? Well, Sturgis, the master, he was so impressed. This is amazing what I'm about to read to you, folks. Listen to this. He was so impressed with the new Richard Allen that he asked Richard Allen to bring the same Methodist preacher who preached the gospel to Allen to speak to him. So Sturgis noticed his change in Allen and said, you know that Methodist guy that preached to you, will you bring him in to preach to me? So the Methodist preacher comes in, preaches to the master, and upon hearing the gospel, the master is converted. I'm using master. I don't like that term. I don't know what else to say, okay? Sturgis. I'll say his real name. I don't like saying that, even though I understand. It's just, I don't like it. He was converted as well. And then guess what happened? A lot of Methodists, by God's grace, opposed slavery. And guess what? Sturgis now had an opposition to slavery. He no longer agreed with slavery. Now, there was a challenge, though, a financial reality. He was in debt. So he wanted to free his slaves, but he couldn't immediately do it. So what did he do? I don't know. I'm glad he did this, what he did here. Here's what he did. He said, I'm going to let Allen and a brother go to earn money to purchase your own liberty. So he let them go, even though they're technically still slaves, to earn money so then they could buy their freedom. And this happened in 1780. So they were technically still slaves, but he released them so they could earn money to do it. You see what I'm saying? So they went out for work right away. He did manual labor, and they bought their freedom. And what did Allen do after he got his freedom? He wanted to speak to other slaves about salvation. So you know how there were circuit riders back then? There'd be a circuit or a district, and the Methodists would jump on horseback, right? And then they would go out, and they would take these circuits, and they were known as circuit riders. And Methodism spread early in early America, or fast in early America, primarily because of these circuit riders, very kind of practical, kind of hands-on, kind of middle-class, sensible gospel message. It was especially big in the Midwest, where they would go to any kind of person and they would do these sermons and stuff to people that really didn't have churches, or they kind of had several churches at once. Well, he didn't have a horse, so Allen became a circuit walker, traveled on foot to his preaching engagements. And sometimes he would be so sore he couldn't even get out of bed, because of how much walking he did. And he went from New York to New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Delaware to Virginia to Maryland, North and South Carolina. And Richard Allen even spent 2 months visiting Native Americans as well. Listen to this. We don't have a lot of records about him, but here's one we do have. This is from Delaware. Richard Allen found a literal treasure chest, a trunk filled with gold and silver he found, right? And instead of keeping it, he spent money to take an advertisement out in the newspaper to say, hey, I found this treasure chest. Will the real owner reclaim it? And so the guy did and was released and tried to give Richard Allen a cash reward. Richard Allen wouldn't take it, quote, believing it to be wrong to accept of such rewards. Now, Richard Allen, I don't agree with you. I would have took that reward. Hey, well, but this dude apparently is a better Christian than I could ever be. So then the owner said, look, let me get you a new suit made. He refused as well. And then the guy said, well, I've got this coarse suit made with coarse cloth that I already have. What about that? And so he took that. Richard Allen, what's up with you, man? Oh, Richard Allen also knew Francis Asbury. If you know anything about Methodist history, he was like the most prominent early American Methodist, Francis Asbury. And Asbury wanted Allen to travel with him to the South, but Asbury told him about the conditions. You're going to have to sleep in the carriage a lot. You can't intermingle with slaves, this kind of stuff. And it would have been a cool thing, because Asbury himself was a mostly commendable man, from what I know. He didn't even receive pay for his work. Asbury didn't, just food and shelter. And so, Allen would have been in the same situation, plus worse. But Allen refused. He respected the bishop, but he refused to go under those conditions, is what the line says there on page 434 of this book, which I respect that decision as well. Now, in 1786, Allen came to Philadelphia. And what did he do? He got right to work among the city's black population there in Philadelphia. This isn't, again, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, because the story I'm about to tell you is just absolutely heart-rending, this story I'm about to tell you, right? So he got to work with the city's black population, mainly downtrodden, with a man named Absalom Jones. And he was even allowed, again, that word, to preach there at St. George's Methodist Church, which was kind of like a white megachurch for its day. And it's called the Mother Church of American Methodism. It was the first large established Methodist work in America. So Allen and Absalom Jones worked throughout the week with the poor blacks of Philadelphia. And then on Sunday mornings, the black members would come with the white members, and they would join together for worship service. Isn't that beautiful? That's fantastic. That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. You know what I'm saying? I like that. But not for long. Because what happened is they were doing such great work that more and more black folks started coming to this mainly white church. So a few black folks was okay, right? Apparently. But once more started coming, there started to become some tension and hostility among the white members of this congregation. And so they had remodeled the church. And when they remodeled it, all of a sudden, the black people had a new place they had to sit. Originally, they were allowed to worship on the main floor. Again, I hate using these words, allowed to worship on the main floor, but that's how it was at that point. So when they remodeled, they said, well, now we've got a section for you. It's the balcony. So on the first day, Richard Allen and the black members went to what they thought was the right section of the balcony. But apparently, they went to the so-called wrong section of the balcony. They didn't know. And this is during prayer. Listen to this. I hate this story. During prayer, one of the Methodist trustees began pulling Absalom Jones up from his knees. Absalom Jones is the elder member of the community. He's older, I think 12 or 18 years, I forget exactly, than Allen. So this Methodist trustee begins pulling him up while he's praying on his knees. Richard Allen is watching this. And there's a conflict within Richard Allen, and it's like this. If the members rise up and say, no, he's an equal member, let him stay, stop this, then we're good. If the members don't say anything and this really happens, we're out of here. Well, so what happens? They pull up the the man during prayer, because they ask, please let me finish prayer, Jones asks. And the guy's just saying, you must get up, you must not kneel here. And then when he asks that, let him finish prayer. No, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away. Now, prayer had ended by this time. And Allen recorded this. He said, we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in the church. Now, civil rights historians say this is the first act of civil rights rebellion or peaceful protest. And I think it really was. And again, it happened by Christian ministers in a Christian context. Now, the situation actually is quite unfortunate, but this is indicative of the larger society at this time, right? So they get up, they leave, never to return. They walk out in the middle of the service. This is an act of protest. Now, peaceful, granted, but... And weren't they right? They were willing to put up with a lot, actually. Being moved to the balcony. Even saying, hey, let us at least finish prayer. We'll go to this other section. But during prayer, they wouldn't. Now, what happened? They began an independent church. An independent Methodist church called Bethel Church. It was dedicated on June 29, 1794, and Francis Asbury preached, and 5 years later he ordained Richard Allen. This church grew to thousands. But guess what? Guess what? Methodist leaders did everything they could to try to get this group under denominational control. They would even threaten expulsion. And so the trustees of Bethel Church in 1807 made a statement about this, which is, again, an act of civil rights advocacy. It's a great statement. You should read it. But these denominational leaders of the Methodist denomination of Philly, they tried threats, pleadings, and even trickery to try to gain control. For example, one Methodist leader, he offered to draw up the papers of incorporation for the new church. And the congregation agreed. They didn't have the technical know-how. But in the meantime, what did he do? He assigned the property to the Methodist denomination. Well, Payne and the others took them to court over this. They took them to court over this, and guess what? They finally got their freedom in the sense of they were able to be an independent church, not controlled by folks who earlier didn't even really want them. So it's like, we don't want you here, but we want to control what you do after. It's just a shame. Another Methodist leader tried to assert his authority over the church, and he said, I'm going to come to church one Sunday, and I'm just going to take charge of the pulpit. The congregation just halted him, just stood in the aisles so that this guy couldn't get up to the pulpit. Again, peaceful protest. But 1816, by the way, was the year that they got the legal recognition as an independent church. And he had trouble also even with his own denomination. I'm not going to be able to read all those stories, but now I need to read something that is both inspiring and infuriating. Richard Allen had a sermon, and he outlined his priorities in it, called A Short Address to the Friends of Him Who Hath No Helper. That's a beautiful title, right? Well, something happened in Philadelphia in 1793. The yellow fever. There's an epidemic. They're saying maybe up to 10% of the population of Philadelphia died in 1793. A lot of people were sick and dying. People were leaving by the hundreds of the city. Philadelphia officials, they asked Allen and Absalom Jones if the black community could help relieve the suffering by serving as nurses and by burying the dead. And they had been assured by the leadership of Philadelphia, if you do this, it'll help the standing of black Americans in the city of Philadelphia. And also, apparently, some of the reason they asked was a false belief that a lot of white people had at the time, which is sort of weird when I read about this, that black folks were immune to diseases like yellow fever because they are originally from tropical regions, and so they were less susceptible to disease, right? But Allen and Absalom and they organized basically a black brigade to selflessly help men and women of all colors to nurse back this stricken city to health. And after the epidemic was over, and I remember they had served selflessly, a writer who himself had fled the city during the epidemic published an attack on the black workers. He accused them of charging exuberant prices for their services and robbing the sick and dead. Crazy. By the way, some of that did happen, but it was done by, and apparently after the facts came out, white folks, not the black folks. And so what did Richard Allen and Absalom Jones do? They realized we need to offer a response. They penned the first piece of civil rights again, peaceful protests in American history. The first thing that was copywritten, the copyright holder, the person who wrote it by a black person in America, this response, they realized we've got to have this recorded or they're going to smear us this way. They set their record straight. That's beautiful. And they were incensed, as you can imagine. They had helped during this time and then were falsely accused after. And here's what they said. We confided in him who can preserve in the midst of a burning fiery furnace, end quote. We're saying that we trusted God, right? And, when I said some people had done it, what I mean is not all the people who did it. Some of the people were white, some of them were black, but they tried to blame it just on black folks. It wasn't that no black folks did it, apparently. And they engaged in this brave work. And listen to this. They talked about some of the things that had happened. This is a quote by Absalom and Jones. A poor, afflicted, dying man stood at his chamber window, praying and beseeching everyone that passed by to help him to a drink of water. So here's a dying man from the yellow fever. He wants just a drink of water, but no one's going to give it to him because they don't want to catch it. A number of white people passed, and instead of being moved by the poor man's distress, they hurried as fast as they could, just like the Good Samaritan, right? Out of the sound of his cries, until at length a gentleman who seemed to be a foreigner, sad it wasn't an American, came up. Now, this is from them being on the front lines. He could not pass by, but had not resolution enough to go into the house. So this guy, he didn't want to leave the situation, but he didn't want to go in himself. So he had $8 in his hand, which would have been a good amount back then, and offered it to several people as a reward for giving the poor man a drink of water. So he was trying to do his part, right? But he was refused by everyone until a poor, this is their words, colored man came up. The gentleman offered the $8 to him if he would relieve the poor man with a little water. Master, replied the good-natured fellow, this is from Allen and Jones' pen, I will supply the gentleman with water, but surely I will not take your money for it. Again, listen to the moral quality of these folks. I mean, it is admirable, to say the least. He went in, supplied the poor object with water, and rendered him every service he could. I want to see that guy in heaven too. By God's grace, I hope. And then they tell the story of during this yellow epidemic fever that there was a white guy who threatened to shoot them if they even passed by his house with a corpse. And then Allen and Jones say 3 days later, we buried that white man. So they even served enemies to them, right? See that? Let me read here. This is a quote from their response. Quote, this is Absalom, Jones, and Richard Allen. We feel ourselves sensibly aggrieved by the censorious epithets of many who did not render the least assistance in the time of necessity, yet are liberal of their censure of us for the prices paid for our services. This has been no small satisfaction to us, saying that the results were worth it, is what they're saying. For we think that when a physician was not attainable, we have been the instrument in the hands of God for saving the lives of some hundreds of our suffering fellow mortals. This is beautiful. While he was in Philadelphia, he had lived there for a lot of years, one day he was confronted by a man on the street who said he was a runaway slave. Now, this was a scary thing for a black person back then because they had passed the Fugitive Slave Law Act, which meant that Southerners could come into the North and would be allowed to extradite folks back to the South and make them slaves again. And sometimes they would do this basically as a way to just get new slaves. They would accuse any black person of being a slave, a runaway slave, and they could get them back. There's rumor that it may have been up to 10,000 people. Well, I don't have the numbers, so I don't want to say that had to do something else. I think how many people left for Canada, but it was bad news, right? And the guy who did this was a professional slave catcher. He made his living tracking down escaped slaves, and he would turn them in for the reward. But guess what happened? Allen, by God's grace, was able to easily prove his identity, and the man who accused him actually ended up imprisoned. But that's not how that story always ended. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, for example, and that's a reminder that slavery in America, it affected you in the North as well. And he wrote a treatise against slavery and addressed to those who keep slaves and approve the practice. And listen to this. I do not wish to make you angry, but excite your attention to consider how hateful slavery is in the sight of God, who hath destroyed kings and princes for their oppression of the poor slaves. Pharaoh and his princes, with the posterity of King Saul, were destroyed by the protector and avenger of slaves. Ooh, that's good. If you love your children, if you love your enemy, if you love the God of love, clear your hands from slaves. Burthen not your children or your country with them. That's good. Then he gave a parallel address called to the people of color. And listen to what he said here. Put your trust in God, who sees your condition, and as a merciful father pitieth his children, so doth God pity them that love him. He goes on and just has some beautiful, beautiful stuff. I can't read it all, but it's a beautiful thing. From Richard Allen. He organized events against people who wanted to have black folks go back to Africa, kind of a forced colonization or a forced deportation into a new colony. Now, if you wanted to, that's one thing, but if you didn't, that's another. And so in January 1817, 3,000 people packed Bethel Church, and they'd had a protest of this colonization movement and had some resolutions here, which are pretty powerful statements in themselves as well. And I'm not going to read about those, but let me read here one of the last things that Richard Allen had written in the meditation that he wrote years before his death, because he died there in 1831. It's this: "Let my last breath, when my soul shall leave my body, breathe forth love to thee, my God. I entered into life without acknowledging thee. Let me therefore finish it in loving thee. Oh, let the last act of life be love, remembering that God is love." Sometimes he's called the father of the black church. Born into slavery, bought his freedom, taught himself to read, write, was converted, and immediately began proselytizing, evangelizing, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And got pulled off, his friends, Absalom Jones, got pulled off his knees while praying. So they founded the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. He also co-founded the FAS, which is the Freed African Society, I believe, which is a mutual aid society. And until his death, he and his wife operated a stop on the Underground Railroad. And you can read more about him in a book called The Faithful Preacher by Thabiti Amobile. Good stuff.